So, as I've mentioned several times, my interest initially was in author-reader relationships, and so I entered this world of writing from the perspective of I needed to discover what authors were trying to do, and so I found myself focusing on, what do we know about exchanges between people coming from conversational communication theories such as speech act theory. And could we study those sort of conversations to sort of see how synchronized they were or not synchronized? To what extent people listeners attended to speakers, or readers attended to authors? And what were people saying about those exchanges? And so my interest in that area could draw heavily from theorists, as I said, speech act theorists, people like Paul Grice's conversational principles, cooperative principles. I also was getting into it through text analysis. I was doing extensive analyses of text, particularly focusing upon the semantic aspects of text, objects and agents and temporal and spatial aspects of text, rather than traditional grammatical categories. And found myself quite frustrated at times, sort of thinking that I could actually come to grips with an author's representation, and finding myself and the people I was working with together, we were finding ourselves frustrated by the fact that that we couldn't pin it down, that we could sort of map it out from what we thought was what could be represented by the text. But indeed, the text have a certain amount of elasticity to it. I once played golf with a conductor and a guy who was visiting the University of British Columbia and to lead their opera group. And he was quite a world-famous conductor. And I was talking to him about reading and these issues of author-reader relationships, and the extent to which oftentimes we use the metaphor of an orchestra, that when one reads is sort of like one is sort of dealing with an orchestra pulling together something in a sort of a composition. And I asked him, well, how does this play out when you're a conductor? And he said to me, he says, well, fortunately, most music is elastic. Because as a conductor, particularly opera, I need some space with the music so that I can draw in the singer and the musicians at the same time. And I thought that was a wonderful metaphor for the fact that texts aren't really fixed in terms of meaning. They're oftentimes more suggestive. And indeed, when you look at text across cultures, you will find that their relationship to fixed meaning varies significantly. For example, I oftentimes now find myself dealing with translations of things I've written for Chinese audiences, and have discovered that if I actually gave my text to two different translators, I'd actually get two different renditions of the text. That there's not that sort of one-to-one, as closely one-to-one relationship in some languages to one's meaning, and that will manifest itself, for example, particularly in Chinese text, but certainly as translate text. And so, from a researcher perspective, if you want to get a sort of a sense of this author-reader relationship, you can sort of dig into attempts to analyze that text and involve different people in that, and you will find that you'll experience exactly what I was experiencing. And likewise, in my attempts to really start to deal with this, I started to sort of ask myself, well, how are readers responding to this? What if I have an author who's a little bit like the role in House of Cards, who clearly identifies himself as somebody who actually speaks to the audience, And going back to the sort of to the notions coming out of Greek discussions of persona and ethos. And so I found myself gravitating to to looking at the relationship that existed between the author and their subject, the reader and the subject, and the author with the reader. And so as I examined different texts and played around with who was the author, and played around with the author having a close relationship with the reader, and a topic that the reader was familiar with or not, I found that I was able to get quite significant differences in things like recall and views of the topic and views of the author. And so I found that this sort of model, which actually I drew from a Walker Gibson, to be a very powerful vehicle for beginning to map out what was going on in text and actually plan different studies where I could, excuse the word, manipulate these different sort of things and actually show that there was an effect, that this is indeed an issue, author-reader relationship, which one is contending with as one is making meaning. And you see it as you, again, in that House of sort of Cards situation where the key actor in that all of a sudden turns around and talks to you, so it brings you in. And if you look at text historically, particularly English text, you'll sort of see how that type of meta discourse, or whatever it is, reaching out to the audience, has increased. Indeed, Woody Allen historically has done that quite a lot in his movies, where he actually tries to, as a director, sort of move almost the reader into that sort of world, and so it's actually a sort of an interesting way to begin to sort of delve into these author-reader relationships. What I thought was one of the most interesting studies that I did, which I actually have at my academia.com site, is a study of epistemologies, where I use this diagram and to help me sort of frame the research study, particularly the analyses. But I interviewed two researchers, one who was fairly traditional empiricist, very oriented towards positivism and quantitative work, and the other person who was a well-known qualitative researcher, very much a constructivist. And both had published articles in the Reading Research Quarterly, and I wanted to sort of interview them relative to their work, themselves as an author and the reader. And so I would sit down with them and move them through the first page, let's say the review of the letter, or first couple of pages, and sort of say, what are you trying to do here? What are you trying to represent in the subject? What are you trying to impress upon the reader? And how are you trying to come across as the researcher? And it was very interesting. The review of the literature, the quantitative and traditional empiricist was very much interested in this sort of concept of aggregation of knowledge, and making clear that she was talking about this work in a fairly objective, distant sort of fashion. Whereas the qualitative person was much more personally involved and wanted to engage with the reader and talk about the subject more in terms of the lens that might be useful to explore this. Wasn't into the aggregation knowledge. And so I then moved the person through the methodology and wanted them to talk about, well, what were they doing in the methodology section, what were they doing in the results section, and what were they doing in the discussion of results and implications. Well, using this diagram, you could actually sort of guide your interview through and see quite distinct differences in epistemologies. And I would think that you could almost do this in a sense tied up with cross-cultural studies relative to beginning to discern the rhetorical ploys and the expectations of different texts associated with the histories or the epistemologies in different cultures. What I found fascinating in this study of the two researchers, these interviews, and I don't think you could do research like this without these interviews tied to the text, so that you could actually unpack what it is that authors are trying to do, what they actually do in terms of representing these ideas, and how they think readers should respond and how readers do respond. As I said, what was sort of very interesting here is when we got to the results section, the quantitative person continued in their third person sort of objective, distant sort of way. When you got to the results section with the qualitative person, they shifted from first person to third person. And I said to my colleague, I said, "You've shifted to third person here." And his comment was, "Well, unfortunately this journal, I felt like I needed to do this for the journal to impress upon them the objectivity of the findings, but that's not how I feel about them." And so you can sort of see how these sort of things play out in the world of science, in the world of epistemologies, in the world of values, and how they can sort of play out, similar sorts of things sort of play out in the context of classrooms. Well, anyhow, this author-reader stuff sort of opened me up to the realization of to what extent you've got such interesting transactions going on, and that authors are operating a little bit like a normal exchange. They're expecting a conversation, in a sense, with the reader, that the author is having a conversation with himself or herself, like my quantitative and qualitative researcher. And indeed, the reader, when they're reading the text, is having that same sort of conversation with themselves. And so I found myself very interested in some of the work on author-reader relationships, very much along the lines of Don Murray, which was looking at studies of writers reading their own writing, but also, in a sense, studies of readers as if they were writing their own text. And so I began to talk about, indeed I wrote a paper with David Pearson at this time for the National Society for the Study of Education publication on learning to read like a writer. And it was focused very much on the fact that in this diagram here, you've got an exchange going on between the reader and the writer, as well as here, you've got an exchange going on between the writer and himself as the reader. What's interesting, by the way, as you look at this thing, is this diagram also has parallels with the diagram that I shared in the discussion of metacognition that I think John Bransford had proposed, the tetrahedral model, which had the task, the text, and the learner. And what's interesting about the fact that this model was developed is that it doesn't really deal with this complex dynamic that's going on. That indeed I think too often in reading, we're sort of focused on this relationship without realizing that undergirding this relationship is this transaction that's going on. The author with the reader, the writer with the reader, the reader himself, the author, the writer himself or herself, the reader, as well as the exchange across the conversation and transaction across one another. So this issue of author-reader opened me up to sort of thinking, wow, we really need to open up much more to the fact that, and Lucy Calkins said it well in a book, Lessons from the Child, where she sort of said that when you begin to open students up to the fact that there are authors, real authors who are like themselves, or that they stop thinking that the book they're reading was produced by a machine. They realise it's produced by somebody, and that indeed their reading of it is a interpersonal experience.